A dreary desert of sand and gravel extends from Snake River almost to the Columbia. Here and there is a thin and scanty herbage insufficient for the pasturage of horse or buffalo. Indeed, these treeless wastes between the Rocky Mountains and the Pacific are even more desolate and barren than the naked upper prairies of the Atlantic side. They present vast desert tracts that must ever defy cultivation and interpose dreary and thirsty wilds between the habitations of man, in traversing which the wanderer will often be in danger of perishing. Washington Irving.
You've all seen pictures of the Oregon Trail coming through Idaho, and they didn't call it the Idaho Trail. There was no reason to be in Idaho because there was water, but it was down in a deep canyon generally, and everything else was just sagebrush.
The climate of the Snake River Plains has for its leading characteristics aridity, prevailing high temperatures in summer, and severe cold in winter. The summers are decidedly hot. Not infrequently for many consecutive days, and even for weeks at a time, the temperature during the hours of sunshine is over 100 degrees. The prevailing winds, often heavily dust-laden, are from the west, and at many times blow with such strength and constancy to become trying to a person's nerves. Israel Russell.
For millennia, the plains of southern Idaho had one distinct quality, that of dryness and desolation. Those who would settle here, both Native American peoples and those from European descent, found the conditions harsh and unforgiving. One resource of seemingly unlimited water was the Snake River. However, one major problem prevented any use. It runs through a deep black rock gorge.
Well, again, as the Oregon Trail was coming west, where the Milner Dam is now, the canyon goes down to the point where you cannot get to water for animals. You can, obviously, for irrigating purposes, it seemed impossible.
But as the 19th century was coming to a close, a new era of optimism and opportunity began to rise. Eyes turned to the mighty Snake River and its seemingly limitless amounts of water that could be used to irrigate a crop. To do so, the river had to be conquered and tamed, a task that would take determination, sacrifice, and an amazing display of the human spirit. The mighty Snake River begins as three tiny streams near the southern boundary of Yellowstone National Park. From these humble beginnings, a mighty river forms that becomes the watershed of 108,000 square miles of 6 states, the 10th largest in the nation. As the river works its way west across Idaho, it becomes larger with each stream, creek, and spring. At its most southern point, the watercourse dives into a black-walled canyon and begins a violent journey downward over rapids and waterfalls. In 1811, the first explorers from the east encountered the Great Snake River Canyon, and they were met with great disappointment.
Our journey was less fortunate on the 28th, for after passing through several rapids, we came to the entrance of a narrow gorge. Mr. Crook's canoe capsized. One of his companions drowned, and we lost a great deal of merchandise. On the 29th, I went with 3 men to see if we could take our canoes through the north side of the gorge. Its bed is no more than 60 to 90 feet wide. It is full of rapids, and its course is broken by falls 10 to 40 feet high, except at 2 spots where I went down to get water. The banks are precipitous everywhere. Wilson Price Hunt.
When the Wilson Price Hunt party came through here in 1811, they were looking forward to the idea of floating all the way from here to the Columbia River. And so that area near the Milner Dam is where they were forced to abandon. And of course, as they came down, all their disappointments, they left their horses back east, and so they ended up walking all the way to what's now Astoria.
Over the next few decades, explorers, trappers, and immigrants would make their way across the dry plains, each intent on their mission, but with no thought of making this place a permanent settlement. In 1836, Narcissa Whitman, traveling across the country with their husband Marcus, described their journey through the Snake River Plain as lengthy marches without water, rocky and sandy. Idaho would begin to see more and more people from eastern states throughout the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, with the great immigration west on the Oregon Trail. Timing of their journey would usually end up with the wagon trains making their way across the Snake River Plains in August, the hottest and driest time of the year.
Monday, August 1st. Drove 7 miles this morning and came to Snake River again. No feet again here. Nothing but sage covers the face of this broad plain. We watered here and started again, and of all the rock roads, this day's travel is the worst, and dust too dense to speak of, for our stock and ourselves are choked almost to suffocation. We followed down the river for 12 miles and came to Rock Creek, where we found some good spring water, a luxury, and camped. Grass very scarce. Elizabeth P. Goltra.
I mean, it had to be terribly unattractive. If you're coming through, they figure most people are coming through here in about August. How hot it is and the dust and everything. So, and they were bent on going to Oregon country. This was just somewhere that you just pass through to get to Oregon.
But I think another really key factor is these were people from the East, and they were looking for something that looked like where they grew up. Having grown up in Ohio and Kentucky, I could relate to that. So in Oregon and Washington, of course, you had trees, which would have been similar to what they had.
Back in the later 1800s, the vegetation in the desert was primarily sagebrush and Agriparium speculatum, which is a tall bunch grass. And even the people that came across the valley in the time of the Oregon Trail from 1848 to about 1860 or so, they have recorded losing their children out in the tall grass because the kids were shorter than the grass, the bunch grass. And the grass would only grow maybe 2 feet in diameter, but it wouldn't have another plant for 4 or 5 feet. And then there'd be sagebrush interspersed.
Thoughts about settling and cultivating Idaho's arid lands began to change as new immigrants would begin to see that the soil was actually good for growing. It was just a matter of how to get enough water.
There's kind of a rule of thumb when it comes to agriculture, that you have to have an average of 20 inches of rain per year to do reasonable dryland agriculture. In Idaho, the average on the Snake River Plain is right around 12 inches per year, so it's considerably less than what you would need to consistently raise crops just from rain.
Prior to 1860, irrigation of crops in Idaho was something nobody hardly considered. In 1847, Brigham Young, the leader of a group of immigrants calling themselves the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, arrived at the Great Salt Lake to establish a new life for his people. These new immigrants began to spread out from the central location in Utah, even as far north as what would eventually become the Idaho Territory.
By the 1860s, people realized how important that water was, that if you could get it out, you could farm. So the early Mormon pioneers were the first to start farming in the Upper Valley, the Idaho Falls area and Rexburg areas, because it was easier to get the water out of the river at those places.
But it was not the pursuit of raising a fine and productive crop that brought the first major influx of settlers to Idaho. It was something that had taken the nation by storm and had caused another major migration across the country to California in 1849. Gold. Gold was first discovered in Idaho on the Clearwater River in 1860. Southern Idaho would experience its own gold bonanza starting in 1869, and mining settlements would appear in the Snake River Canyon bearing names like Springtown, Drytown, Mudbarville, Walterburg, and Shoshone City.
Mining was really important. It didn't last very long. But what you have is the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad and Promontory Point in 1869. All of a sudden you've got a whole bunch of unemployed workers. And it's just very convenient that in 1869 there was a discovery of gold in this area. So in 1870 there was a tremendous influx of population. And the problem, of course, with the gold is that it was very, very thin, called flour gold.
Soon, most of the miners went elsewhere in the pursuit of easier diggings. But once again, it would not be long until the hunt for riches would bring them all back, this time in search of lead, silver, and gold in the Wood River Valley. By 1881, settlements like Haley, Bellevue, Bullion, and Ketchum were seeing around 75 men per day make their way into the area. Among those drawn to the Wood River mining scene was a young man from Delaware, Indiana, who would eventually make a big and lasting impact upon the Snake River Plain, Ira Burton Perrine.
When he came here, in the early 1880s, he was a miner. He went up to the mines in the Wood River Valley, and he was of such small stature that he did not make a very good miner, and so he bought a herd of dairy cattle, and he would provide milk, to the miners.
With winter coming on, Bert, as he was commonly called, did as many others would do at that time and take his herd south to winter on the milder plains. While searching for a suitable grazing location in and around the Snake River Canyon, he came across a man who knew the area better than anyone around.
In the fall of 1884, when I was living on the north side of the Snake River at Shoshone Falls, I was awakened one night by the bold rap at my cabin door. Hastily arising and lighting the lamp, I inquired, "Who's there?" A voice from without answered, asking if this was Charlie Walgamot's cabin, saying, "My name is Bert Perrine, Charles Walgamot."
Charles Shirley Walgamot came to southern Idaho in 1875 after his sister Irene Trotter had moved with her husband to Rock Creek, Idaho, and informed him of the area during a visit to the family in Iowa.
And he was very young when he arrived, and he kind of fell in love with the area. Walgamot was basically kind of a romantic. And this area, undeveloped, lots of open space, fit him to a T.
Walgamot became involved in a number of occupations, including mining and working at the Rock Creek store. Because of his love for this new land he had thrown himself into, Charles became an expert in many of the interesting geological features of the canyon. It was for this reason that Bert Perrine had sought him out, and Walgamot knew of just the perfect place that would suit the young dairyman.
Next morning, we drove the cattle to the Blue Lakes and with very little trouble worked them down the Indian Trail to the valley below. I.B. Perrine was pleased. He had found his utopia. Here his youthful vision began to expand. He had planted himself in a spot immediately surrounded by things beautiful, but both to the north and south, desolation reigned. This desolation enhanced the beauty of Blue Lakes and afforded food for thought for the imaginative mind of the dreamer, I.B. Perrine.
Perrine at that point seemed to really be taken by Blue Lakes. I think one of the fascinating things about I.B. Perrine is living in Indiana, and I grew up in Ohio, is that while he loved this area, he wanted to make it look like home. And making it look like home meant putting water on it and growing trees, which I think is fascinating because Easterners come here and they say they like the West, but then they try to make the West look like the East.
When the Oregon Short Line Railroad was completed into the rail town of Shoshone, a spur was immediately built toward the Wood River Valley mines, bringing the likes of Ira Perrine and scores of others like him. But the railroad offered another opportunity for development for the desert lands of Idaho: tourism. The Great Shoshone Falls was now considered one of the great wonders of America, and the railroad stop in the city of Shoshone was the gateway to this majestic old waterfall. One person who got in on the ground floor with his new wave of hauling tourists to see the falls was Charles Walgamot. Along with Joe Sulloway, a veteran stage driver, Walgamot would establish a stage route and tent hotel just above the northern brink of the falls.
We inaugurated a daily stage line from Shoshone to Shoshone Falls. Leaving Shoshone early in the morning, we would return in the evening with all pomp and promptness of the Ben Halliday stage line. For better than 3 weeks, we made those trips without a single passenger. And then, finding that our money had all been converted into horse feed, we ran a bluff for a while by leaving Shoshone on time, driving out a few miles, and turning the horses out on grass until we returned on time in the evening. Charles Walgamot.
Despite the rugged and primitive means of getting to the falls, tourists soon forgot their momentary discomfort as they basked in the awe and wonder of the magnificent sight.
Then, at last, came the revelation and the indescribable view of the erratic, rock-bound river. Below us opened up the canyon through which 1,000 feet below the upper levels the Snake had its course. The Great Falls of Shoshone is crescent-shaped and is 225 feet high by 950 feet wide. The plunge is unbroken. Facing it, one sees a quivering wall of water that stretches from one side of the canyon to the other. The roar is deafening, and its force is so great that the displaced air is as fierce as a tornado. The earth trembles from the blow it receives. You yourself are drenched with spray, and the rising mist is like a fog at sea, blown hither and thither, and so catching the sun's rays as to form arc upon arc of glorious color. Edwards Roberts.
Another person who saw the opportunity to use tourism to boost his well-being was I.B. Perrine. From the moment he first settled at the Blue Lakes in the Snake River Canyon, Perrine began transforming it into a little oasis nestled next to the hot black basalt walls.
And almost immediately, Perrine began to be involved in all kinds of things. In 1885, he's planting fruit trees from the Hagerman, present-day Hagerman area. He was running a stage service. But one of the early things I think we can kind of nail him down on before he got involved in the interest in irrigation later was that he and his wife built what they called a hotel, and it was not very big. But his idea was to get people who would come to Shoshone Falls would be interested in seeing his place as well.
Perrine's ranch continued to flourish and grow as each year passed. The fertile soil of the canyon floor was very good for growing, and water from the springs feeding Blue Lakes was diverted into ditches to irrigate a wide variety of produce. Bert began to make a name for himself in local settlements for the quality of his fruit.
Last Saturday, Bert Perrine unloaded a watermelon off the walk in front of the Journal office that outweighed the one brought up from Clark's grade by Mr. Smalley by 83 pounds. Mr. Smalley's weighing 216 pounds. We are safe in saying this is the largest watermelon ever raised in southern Idaho, and is only a little smaller than those grown on Mesquite Flat on the lower Salt River, Arizona. Dr. Smith says the year before the Mexican War, he raised one down there that weighed just 482 pounds. And after Fremont's army had eaten the inside, he used the shell for a water tank. The Shoshone Journal.
Bert would market his produce in places like Albion, the seat of Cassia County, where the market for fruit was good by means of a thriving town and the Albion Normal School, which had been established in 1893 to educate school teachers. Perrine would load up his freight wagon and make a regular trek to the town. A natural landmark along the way was a place known as the Cedars. It is here that the Snake River makes a dramatic fall in elevation as it begins its downward journey into the Blackwalled Canyon that Bert called home. Local settlers had explained to Perrine that there had been talk for years of diverting water from this spot. Irrigating the fertile lands at Blue Lakes had been productive, and with water from the river, the land above the canyon could be as well.
It was here he could see the mighty Snake River tearing its way through the canyon, And as he looked to the west down the river for more than 50 miles, he could see on both sides of the river those vast sagebrush plains that to I.B. Perrine were calling for water. Here was an ideal place for a dam. Charles Wagamot.
There was another factor that enabled Perrine to dream of an irrigated valley: the law. Years earlier, Frank Riblet, a surveyor for Cassia County, had begun to entertain the possibility of large-scale irrigation projects on the Snake River Plain. However, laws were not yet conducive to establishing irrigation companies in the West. One attempt at reclaiming land was the Desert Land Act, but its terms only allowed for individuals to prove up and settle lands, not large development companies. All of that would change in 1894 with a law known as the Carey Act. The architect of this legislation was Wyoming Senator Joseph Maul Carey, a man who had made his way west at the age of 22, just following the American Civil War, and had been elected a United States Senator for Wyoming in 1890. Though his proposal was introduced in 1892, it was stalled in Congress for 2 years before being attached to an appropriations bill.
Well, basically, the Carey Act, the federal government gave the land to the state, and then the state was to sell that to farmers. The state kept the money that they got, and then after the prove up, the state returned to the federal government the land that wasn't developed. And unfortunately, there's not an awful lot of Carey Act companies that survived. A lot of people tried it, because the thing is, it was all developed with private money.
So by the late 1800s, most of the good land was taken, and all they were left with is just this desert land. So how do you attract people to the desert? And so they knew that it centered around water, and the only way to get water to a lot of people, the individual person could not do that themselves. So they knew they had to introduce the third party, which is the land developer and the irrigation tract developer, which were usually the same unit.
But not everyone embraced the Carey Act with open arms. Some felt that opening lands to development corporations would lead to monopolies, and even equated the act to serfdom in Europe.
A big irrigation company has filed papers for the withdrawal of 108,000 acres of land from settlement in Bingham County under the terms of the Carey Act. Idaho will be a great country for tenant farms after a while, with the land and water monopolized by big corporations. The Idaho County Free Press.
Despite some of the skepticism surrounding it, the Carey Act would prove to be just the thing Perrine needed to make his dream of an irrigated desert a reality. But Bert's personal finances were nowhere near what was needed to build a system of the size he was dreaming of. He was known as a person of great charm, possessing great enthusiasm and a magnetic personality, and this would ultimately help him in finding those who had money to invest.
I would dearly love to know him, or have known him. My grandmother went to school with his daughter, and she was down in the Blue Lakes country with her when they were young girls. And she many times talked about talking with him. But the thing that amazed me is he was a huge visionary, but he was a short man in stature. He was not a huge man. He was a very slight man. I think he was only 5'6" or 5'8", something like that. And then you see him against some of the people that financed it. My golly, these were men of huge girth and weight, and here's poor little I.B. Perrine sitting there, and he's the brain to put this whole thing together.
He also knew some people in Salt Lake City who knew some people back east, and that way they got the money came together. And there were some moments there when it looked like the whole thing was going to fall apart. But Perrine made promises that he didn't know if he could keep, but it came through in the end.
One of the Salt Lake connections Perrine would draw upon was Stanley Milner, a man with whom he had attempted to enter into a partnership over some mining ventures a few years earlier. Using Milner's help and finances, Perrine gathered a group of irrigationists and bankers to form the Twin Falls Land and Water Company under the Carey Act. The first order of business, doing initial surveys of the land and securing the water rights. But there was one detail that loomed large over the idea that had the possibility to crush it: tourism. For some time there had been a looming proposal to turn the Snake River Canyon, with its majestic beauty and inspiring waterfalls, into a Shoshone National Park.
The irony of that proposal of creating a national park out of Shoshone Falls area, Perrine was big into tourism. He thought that would be a huge, boon to the area. But then he had a dilemma, because you can bring tourists here, but if you don't have a town and people living here making a living, you don't have tourism either.
And basically, if you look back in the late 19th century, I think the idea was a national park should be where it wasn't good for anything else. I mean, we look at Yellowstone today, we say it's beautiful, but what stands out about Yellowstone is you can't plow it. So if you can't plow it, you might as well set it aside. And so there was interest, and in fact, in 1898, Idaho had really pushed for the possibility of a national park.
With the possibility of irrigating the desert, politicians began to speak out against the park idea, observing that settling the land for agriculture would do more for the new state of Idaho than tourism would. But the national park idea was not the only hurdle that would threaten to shut down the project before water had been diverted across the plain. Perrine had partnered with Harry Hollister, a man from Chicago who had come to the Wood River Valley to get involved with mining. Both men were considering the idea of using the rushing waters of Shoshone Falls to generate power, but Hollister had run into trouble with the owners of the Shoshone Falls Hotel, and a legal battle soon began to rage out of control. With the knowledge that Perrine was tied to a power plant idea, two company shareholders expressed concern that the power plant would encroach on the company's water right.
So as a result of that, two of the guys, Steunenberg and Lowell, decided they wanted to get out of the project. And by them deciding to do that, then there was a major capital shortage.
In November of 1902, a man from Sharon, Pennsylvania came to Salt Lake City to look into some mining investments. His name was Frank Buell. He and his longtime friend Peter Kimberly had made a fortune off of steel and iron, and now they had plenty of cash to sink into other investments. By the time Buell had arrived to look at the property, it had been sold. Still looking to invest money into a project, it was suggested that he might consider the irrigation developments in southern Idaho. Milner and Perrine took him on a tour of their project in an attempt to convince him to invest money. It worked. Buell agreed to back the project, but the conflict over the proposed power plant would claim one more victim, and it was an important one. Due to his involvement in both projects, I.B. Perrine was forced to surrender control to Frank Buell. Burt would continue to work as a team player in the venture and remained a devoted promoter of the tract he dreamed would one day be green. With money secured, work on the project began to get underway. One of the first things to accomplish was surveying the area around the Cedars where a construction camp and the dam were to be built. To honor the man who was putting his money and reputation into the project, the area would soon be known as Milner.
And they, of course, had to have a huge crew of people to build that dam. And the first thing they had to do was to put in a bridge. It was a toll bridge, by the way, which was just below where the dam is. And they had all kinds of businesses that you could imagine: livery services, drugstores, boarding houses, places to eat, all those kinds of things. So Milner really grew rapidly.
Another thing that had to be accomplished early on was the preparation of tying two islands together to form Milner Dam, the structure which would divert water from the Snake River into the canals.
And the only reason the Milner Dam is there is to bring the river up so it can flow out. It's not a storage dam. If we brought it down 10 feet, we couldn't get the water out of it.
Building the dam would not be an easy task. The structure would have to be sound enough to hold back the massive amounts of water. Large electric machinery was brought in to construct the main dam. Timbers were imported to serve as the core of the structure, and earth and rock had to be moved in for the purpose of fill.
One of the problems was getting adequate amounts of cement, and getting the rock crusher to get the cement in the right shape was one problem. Another problem which they encountered was wet weather, and they certainly worked when it was not ideal, but there was limitations on that as well.
While early preparations were underway on the dam, another crew was busy at work, carving out the first 25 miles of the canal system. But once they got away from the Milner site, the work became much more strenuous.
It was just a horse-drawn wagon and a scraper. They're a four-horse team on a wagon was a pretty big outfit at the time. They didn't have D8 cats or anything, and when you think it was all built with muscle power. It was either horses or people that did it.
The people who would work on the system were a unique and diverse group. As the project would continue to grow, there would be nearly 700 people all working to complete this massive irrigation system that was intended to irrigate a total of 200,000 acres.
This was a very hard-working crew who were involved in construction. It was dangerous. There were a lot of explosives. There were rocks. The rocks were heavy. They were unstable. And so these people were brought in, and they were paid about $1.30 a day. And just to give you an idea, a good hotel, or a good hotel at the time, and a bath was about $1.30. So to put it in that way, it would take a day's wages to get a bath, I want to say a shower, but a bath, and a night in a hotel. So they had lots of immigrants working, as was true of so many of the jobs of that time. People would work hard, who were kind of desperate, and these camps were usually divided up by ethnic groups. For example, the camp that had Italian people were called Dago camps, which was a kind of a term of derision in the early 20th century for Italians.
As 1903 approached the summer months, the Twin Falls Land and Water Company began to make preparations to open up land for the farmers who would be transforming this arid desert. A land drawing was set to take place on July 1st, 1903 at the Opera House in Shoshone. Company officials prepared for the big day by providing a fleet of horse-drawn buggies to allow prospective land buyers the ability to examine the area.
The Desert Evening News. The drawing yesterday by the Twin Falls Land and Water Company at Shoshone in the allotment of lands for settlement was a good deal of a frost. As the names of only 57 applicants for lands were found in the box, and of these but 29 availed themselves of the choices drawn, and of the 60,000 acres thrown open, only 4,000 were actually entered.
And Buell was there, Milner was there. It was a big deal. And they were expecting lots and lots of people. And as it turned out, there were only 57 people who put their name in as interested. And of those, only 30 actually made purchases. And the reality is that these purchases, a lot were friends and acquaintances, the kind of people who come to your graduation ceremony. And it created a lot of discouragement. In fact, Buell was very discouraged.
The first opening of the Twin Falls South Side was considered by all a failure. Mr. Buell went east with knitted brows. In a few days, he called a company meeting in Chicago, notifying Walter Filer, the general manager, to come to Chicago at once and bring that farmer, Perrine, with him. It developed at the meeting that considerable discouragement existed. Mr. Buell, who was naturally of a gruff disposition, was at the meeting not only gruff, but angry, and blamed Perrine, who had promised not only once, but many times that if they would put water on the land, it would sell. Charles Wagamont.
One of the main reasons the land drawing did not attract hordes of settlers was due to the fact that workers were still only working on a diversion tunnel to be used in building the dam, and the first promised 25 miles of canals were not even finished yet. Many interested people could not see much hope in a promise that water would be delivered when the work was barely started. But Perrine was still able to convince Buell that the idea was worth it, and a new idea was proposed to attract settlers to the area: build a town.
And so they created two new corporations to work with this. There was the Town Site Company, the Twin Falls Town Site Company, and then there was the Twin Falls Investment Company, which was created in Boise. And that is where Perrine would really shine. He became a key player in the Twin Falls Investment Company and helped Buell to kind of gain his confidence back that this was a viable project.
A little over a year after the disappointing land drawing of 1903, the first lot was sold in the town, now known to everyone on the project as Twin Falls. The town began to grow rapidly with new buildings and new people seemingly showing up every day.
And an interesting tidbit is that by the end of December of 1904, even before the railroad came, there were 75 buildings in the town. And there were a lot of people who lived in tents down in Rock Creek, because that's where the water was.
The amazing thing is really how fast things took off when they did get population. I think in 1905, they knew in order to bring people, they had to make this an attractive town. So a guy by the name of James Waters was a landscaper and had a nursery, and he planted 5,000 trees in 1905. That was before the water made it to Twin Falls. So they actually bucketed water from Rock Creek and hand watered all those trees, keep them going. It just shows what a concerted effort. It took 110% from everybody.
It is astonishing how Twin Falls City and the surrounding country is building up. When I took a last peep at the town as the road car carried us out of sight, I could scarcely credit that it stood on the spot which I saw covered with rank sagebrush only a few months ago. Thomas Costello.
Back out on the desert, the year of 1904 had been spent constructing Milner Dam and building miles and miles of canals. As the crews continued to work west, they would encounter new obstacles and challenges that would test their ability and ingenuity.
And in a sense, although it had been surveyed, when they got right down to working on it, they had to get to the detail, which we're all familiar with in life. But I was reading that they talked about sometimes they just pour water down on the ground to see which way it would go. That's my kind of engineering.
The year 1904 saw much better results in people filing claims on the tract. Even though the water and canals had not reached through the entire area, the progress on the system, teamed with widespread advertising, had yielded good results. The tract was seeing people from all parts of the country who were seeking the opportunity to own land at a decent price with water that would be plentiful.
I don't know what was going on, back in their homes. But it's the American dream, the home ownership and to be a farmer. Many were not farmers. You never know what's in people's past that is going to drive them to out of their current situation into the unknown.
The complex system of canals were continuing to wind their way through the valley. At Dry Creek, a reservoir which would eventually be known as Murtaugh Lake was built to serve as a preventative measure against floods as well as a 2-day emergency water supply. At a place named Point Spill, the canal would run within yards of the Snake River Canyon's edge. Gates were installed to allow water to be spilled into the canyon and back into the river in case of flood or various problems along the system. At the forks, south of the settlement of Hanson, the canal would split into the High Line and the Low Line Canal.
So they had a number of different issues. Probably the largest issue was the getting across Rock Creek with the low-line canal, and they did that with a large siphon called an inverted siphon. It was huge. It was like 10 feet tall. You see pictures of men standing in it. And that was brought out from Sharon, Pennsylvania as well. And they had to bring a crew in to install it and everything.
By early 1905, the system was nearly ready to be used. Even though there were still many miles of main canals to be built, the dam was complete, the gates were installed, and it was time to prove that the years of work and the millions of dollars were all worth it.
The Twin Falls News. The gates of the Twin Falls Land and Water Company's dam at Milner were closed on Wednesday morning, March 1st, and the structure proved as tight as a drum. At 9:50, the officials of the company took their stations at the top of the hoisting capstans, the photographers gave the word, and the baptism of the Cassia County Empire began. At 11 o'clock, the roar of the waters was stilled. Hundreds of people were walking dry-shod across the bed of the river below the dam, picking up strings of fish and probing among the crevices in search of nuggets. Although more than 2,000 men, women, and children swarmed around the works and stood in dangerous places, there were no accidents. Enthusiastic cheers broke from the spectators when the word was given to begin dropping the gates.
There was such anticipation of the opening or the closing of the gates, the opening of the system. And there was a lot of excitement about it. But interestingly, a lot of people were more distracted to the impact it was going to have on the river. They were hoping to find gold nuggets. I don't think they had much success with that. They were hoping to find fish, and they had better success with that. But I think they were really fascinated. The whole idea of the taming of the snake. Here was this river that had been so large.
In the days following the closing of the gates, Milner Dam would suffer from problems of earth falling away from the dam, especially at the north end. The water was lowered, and crushed rock and gravel were filled into the cave-in. The gates also did not seal properly, and concrete had to be poured into the gate bases to keep the water back behind the dam. But by the 13th of March, the repairs were finished and Milner Dam was holding its own very well. Water would slowly be allowed into the system, and there were still many miles of canals under construction. But only 3 months after the gate closing, the company would hit a snag with the death of co-owner Peter Kimberly. In the wake of the death of his good friend, Frank Buell turned the system over to a new company, Trowbridge and Niver. But by August of 1906, Buell would come back on the scene with a newly organized Buell-Kimberly Corporation, which took over the project once again. During this time, the area continued to grow. Out on the tract, the farmers were busy clearing land which for ages had only grown sagebrush and grass.
It was necessary to remove that sage. And it was very slow going. You could do it with a hoe, but that was very, very slow. There was actually a sagebrush grubber that was developed locally, the Hendricks sagebrush grubber that was actually sold and manufactured in Twin Falls. A lot of farmers would just take an old rail and tie it to horses and then drag the rail over, and it would often drag the sagebrush out.
In the meantime, the canal system was all that labor, and all the ditches and the mossing and everything was all done by hand, and it was hard work for the people, and to keep the water moving, keep it coming. And
I can't believe how these canal systems and agriculture in southern Idaho was developed. I mean, to give up your life in Illinois or wherever you came from and come out here to clear sagebrush and hopefully have water and scratch out crops out of the desert soil, and then figure out a way to market it or to feed your family if you couldn't market it. They were dreamers and visionaries, and they just knew that they were resourceful enough to make it work.
The project was a success, but for now it was only halfway completed. One aspect of the Buell-Kimberly Corporation reacquisition was selling the Milner town site and the irrigation development on the north side of the river to the Kuhn brothers from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1907. One man who was once again involved with the sale and development of this project was none other than Ira Burton Perrine, who would serve as the general manager of the newly formed Twin Falls Northside Land and Water Company.
What had happened now is that Twin Falls had become so successful that, like, the Salmon Project had the name Twin Falls in it. The North Side, which is kind of lost today because people in the North Side Canal, you don't think about Twin Falls, but it was like this was the kiss of blessing to put Twin Falls and all of that.
With this new project phase underway, the town of Milner was revived. A hotel was built, businesses moved in, and laborers began to fill the town. Work began on the canal system running north from the dam, with the first land opening being slated for the fall of 1907.
If you go up where we divert water out of Milner, you'll see that we had to blast through a great, a couple 3 miles of rock to get the water out on this plain. And they tell of the great sagebrush blast they made. And I don't know, you hear all kinds of stories about how many barrels of powder they used to make it, but they popped off a big one and it threw rocks every place. And supposedly about one big old rock went clear over the river and came down through the Mercantile and hit a barrel of eggs. Whether it's true or not, I don't know, but it's a good tale. But that blast, it must have been something to see. I think they toned it down a little after that. But
they had to use horses and Fresnos to construct the embankments to build the canals. And for the north side system, it runs across a lot of lava rock out there. They couldn't dig that, and it was not economical to do a lot of blasting to make really clean, neat, engineered channels. So they had to use a little more ingenuity and deal with what they had that nature had left behind, and just build concrete walls, move a lot of soil to build up the embankments to keep the water flowing where they wanted it to go.
By October of 1907, the canals had reached the town of Jerome. A land drawing was held that resulted in a completely different response than the first drawing on the southern Idaho desert only 4 short years before.
48,000 acres of Carry Act land filed upon in 48 consecutive hours, with a total of over 60,000 acres in 3 days, is the record made at Jerome, the capital of the Twin Falls Northside Project. No such rush was ever witnessed in the West, not even when Uncle Sam gave land away to homesteaders. It took 20 months to sell 50,000 acres on the south side, not because the land was not a good buy, but the people wanted to be shown. They have been shown, and now they are convinced that Carry Act land in this part of the state is cheap at any reasonable price. The Twin Falls News.
The population of the valley continued to grow as the systems on both sides of the river completed more canals and ultimately were reorganized into their own self-governing companies, the Twin Falls Canal Company and the Northside Canal Company. The acreage under the plow also continued to grow, which would eventually cover more than 375,000 acres of land, with the water stretching as far west as Castleford on the south side and King Hill on the north. As the years would roll on, more people would take advantage of the opportunity to farm on the plains of Idaho. And no matter what obstacle would arise to challenge them, their pioneer spirit would not allow for giving up. They would continue to build, continue to innovate, and continue to transform the high desert plains into a place that is now distinctly known as the Magic Valley.
Well, as people say now, it couldn't be done today. It just is not possible. I mean, it was a shot in the dark, and they made it work. Quite amazing.
I don't think we can even fathom the life that those people were doing back in the 1910s when they came here. It was tough. You always hear about the beautiful things, but there had to be an awful lot of grit and grime and dust at every place. It had grit, dust in your coffee and dust in your boots. And
I think one of the most amazing aspects of this irrigation system in the Twin Falls and other local irrigation systems is the cooperation that was necessary. This was a very highly individualistic period in the West, and people were used to the idea of individualism and the necessity of irrigation requiring collaboration. And after 1909 with the Twin Falls Canal Company, I think that's pretty amazing that they were able to accomplish that.
They've seen something I definitely wouldn't have seen. There had to be some hope and prosperity there somewhere. From what I've seen in old pictures, above on the plateau was just dry dirt, nothing there. Down in the canyon was a little different story. It was green, there was some water, seep water they could water with, do a little bit of farming, a little bit of orcharding, and run cattle down there. But for the work they did, they earned every bit of it.
So they came out here just on a hope and a prayer, and maybe some promises from speculators or other developers, but they didn't find what they thought they were going to find usually, and they just tightened their belts or worked twice as hard or whatever they had to do to not only survive but to thrive and grow the communities and turn it into the Magic Valley that it is today.
We've got a tremendous valley in the Magic Valley. We've got a lot of good ground, and we have a lot of diversity here. We can grow about anything, and we can change and make changes and make things work. So we just hope that we can make it all come together.
There was a gentleman came from Colorado that he came here and he stopped here and talked to me, introduced himself. He says, I'm looking for some farm ground. He says, I've researched that I want irrigated. I've researched everywhere in the States and other areas too, maybe other countries, I don't know. And he says, Twin Falls Canal Company has got the best system and the best water right that and the cheapest water too, compared to some of them, like California. And he did settle here and buy a farm.
I guess probably the thing that I'm most appreciative of is the fact that my great-grandfathers and my grandfathers came out here and started farming, and I'm still here. And this is a viable company, viable farm ground. It's able to make a living. I've owned my first farm now for 44 years.
I think families came from all over the U.S. and they mainly saw brochures or advertisements and thought, boy, there's water there and lots of land, and it looks like a place to go to. So that's kind of the story of the Olmsted family. And so I'm a fourth generation. I still live on the farm, and still own part of the farm, but we lease the ground out now.
But what made Idaho what it is today is not the Diamond Field Jacks. It's the people who got together and formed irrigation companies, Twin Falls Canal Company, the Aberdeen Springfield Canal Company, and the Northside Canal Company. Some of those companies got more federal help than others, but basically it was people working together and other people coming together. They built towns, they built schools, churches, hospitals, and that's what made the West.
Taming the Snake River was no easy task. Ivy Prine truly had a vision and was driven to get things done no matter what. This documentary was produced to help educate others on the history, how a dream can become a reality through hard work, determination, and trusting in the human spirit. On behalf of my partners and team members at Snake River Pool and Spa and the Blue Lakes Inn, thank you to all who gave up their time to help produce the Conquest of the Snake.